Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we would look into I. A. Richards' Practical Criticism, a study of literary judgment. Practical criticism began in the 1920s with a series of experiments by I. A. Richards on his students to assess poems on their own, on which no information regarding authorship or any other extraneous information was provided. Richards wanted his students to concentrate on the words on the page rather than rely on predetermined or accepted opinions of the text. Such a method would have positive psychological effects on the students because they would respond to the myriad emotions and meanings that would result in an organized response. This meant that they would clarify the diverse undercurrents of thoughts in the poems and relate their own emotions with them. This would enable them to arrive at a response that would encompass the thoughts which are in an organized form. William Emerson, in 7 Types of Ambiguity, published in 1930, in connection with this project, developed the undergraduate essays for Richards to study connotative and complex meanings in poems. His method ushered a novel approach of critical analysis known as New Criticism. New critics emphasized on a close analysis of texts, paying little attention to historical or biographical details of a poem. For F. R. Lewis, the close analysis of a text is a moral activity in which the critic would employ his sensibility on the literary text and examine its sincerity and moral seriousness. New criticism would entail concentrating on the form and meaning of particular works rather than theoretical questions, and practice of criticism would not entail social or economic bearings as well as biographical considerations of the author. Let us move into the text now. The text Practical Criticism, a study of literary judgment in 1929 is divided into 4 parts, and it elaborates Richards' views on the practice of literary criticism. The first part, titled Introductory, is an introduction to his critical practice, where he expounds the threefold purpose in writing the book. Part 2, titled Documentation, contains the 13 poems for his students' analysis, and Part 3, titled Analysis, the most significant of the 4 chapters, where his critical precepts are explained. The 8 chapters in this section are 4 kinds of meaning, figurative language, sense and feeling, poetic form, irrelevant associations and stock responses, sentimentality and inhibition, doctrine in poetry, technical presuppositions and critical preconceptions. Part 4 is titled Summary and Recommendations, followed by the appendices A to D. In the introduction, Richards mentions the 3 objectives in writing the book. First, to introduce a new kind of documentation to those who are interested in the contemporary state of culture for critics, philosophers, teachers, psychologists, or those who are just curious onlookers. Second, to provide a new technique for those interested in reading poetry to decide why they should like it or not. And the third, to develop better methods of critical analysis that are different from the existing ones. For this purpose, he has given poems to his students without revealing any information about the poets who wrote them. Richards analyzes the factors that lead to misreading of poems. The first, the difficulty to comprehend the plain sense of a poem. Many students fail to understand the meaning of a poem Often the feeling, tone and intention of a poem are also misunderstood. Second, likewise, words have a movement or rhythm even when read in silence. Many readers fail to capture the sensuousness and rhythm inherent in poetry. The third, imagery, especially visual imagery, is difficult to interpret. Images that take shape in one mind may be different from others, but these images may not be connected to the images that existed in the poet's mind. Fourth, the incredible influence of irrelevant mnemonics, which is the private and personal associations that affect reading texts. Fifth, stock responses based on private judgments intrude when a poem's opinions and emotions are readily available to the reader's mind. Sixth, display of excessive emotions. Seventh, inhibitions function as hindrances in understanding poetry. Eighth, indoctrination, which is views and beliefs about the world contained in poetry, could become the foundation for confusion or unreliable judgment. The ninth point, technical conjectures can cause difficulty. When something has been done in a certain manner, and if it is done differently, that is beyond recognition, it calls for assessing a poem from outside by technical details. Lastly, the general critical preconceptions resulting from theories about the nature and value of poetry intervene between the reader and the poem. Richards concludes that critical reading of poetry is an arduous task. In this regard, he mentions, I quote him, "The lesson of all criticism is that we have nothing to rely upon in making our choices but ourselves." Unquote. This means that the lesson of good poetry, if properly understood, lies in the extent to which ordering of the individual mind takes place. Response to emotion and meaning would result in what Richards calls an organized response that would materialize into psychologism, which is not concerned with the poem but the responses to it. Let us look into what Richards has to say about the 4 kinds of meaning. Close textual and verbal analysis of poetry is elaborated in Richards' Practical Criticism, The Meaning of Meaning and The Philosophy of Rhetoric. Language is comprised of words, and hence the study of words is of immense significance in understanding a work of art. Words communicate 4 kinds of meaning: sense, feeling, tone and intention. The interplay of these 4 entities constitutes meaning in poetry. Let us look into the first one, sense. Sense is communicated by the literal meaning of words. The speaker speaks to arouse the listener's interest. When the writer makes an utterance, he appeals to his listener's attention on some matters, affairs or items for their thought or consideration. The second aspect is feeling. The writer's emotional attitude towards the subject is called feeling. He uses language to express feelings in poetry. Feeling adds color to poetry. In poetry, feeling and sense are mutually dependent. In this regard, Richards mentions, the sound of a word has much to do with the feeling it evokes. Emotion is as important as the use of rhyme or meter. We move on to the next aspect, which is tone. Tone refers to the attitude of the writer towards his listener. The writer chooses and arranges the words according to the level of his audience. This means that the writer's tone varies in accordance with the type of listener. The last aspect is intention, that refers to the aim, purpose or objective of the speaker. The speaker could speak rather consciously or unconsciously. The listener has to comprehend the objective of the speaker to understand his meaning. Devoid of this understanding, the speaker is a failure. The intention of the author is found in dramatic and semi-dramatic literature and controls the plot. The points in an argument are stressed by the intention. Now, these four aspects taken together would account for meaning in poetry. They cannot be separated and they are indispensable to the meaning of a text. Sense predominates over scientific language, similarly feeling in poetry. We move into another aspect called figurative language. Figurative language used by poets conveys emotions effectively and forcefully. Words acquire rich associative value in different contexts. The meaning of a poem is inferred by the use of rhyme and meter. Just as the eye is accustomed to the proper spelling in the text, the mind, after reading a few lines of verse, starts to anticipate the flow of poetry. This anticipation becomes accurate when there is harmony and regularity of sound formed through rhythm and meter. Let us look into what Richards has to say about the use of metaphoric language. Richards says that metaphoric language is important for communication. I quote Richards, "A metaphor is a shift, a carrying over of a word from its normal use to a new use," unquote. This means that metaphors are used to convey special meanings that are suggestive. And in this sense, metaphors are of two kinds: sense metaphors and emotive metaphors. In a sense metaphor, the shift is because of the likeness between the original object and the new one. In the emotive metaphor, the shift is the result of the similarity between the feelings, the new situation and the normal situation that arises. The contextual differences between words may result in the sense metaphor or the emotive one. By the use of metaphor, the writer can cram into a poem more than what could be accommodated. Metaphorical meaning arises from the interconnections between sense, tone, feeling and intention. As Richards observes, a metaphor is a point at which many different influences may cross or unite. Hence, its dangers in prose discussions and its treacherousness for careless readers of poetry, but hence at the same time its peculiar quasi-magical sway in the hands of a master. The deft use of metaphor in poetry generates innumerable impressions that would otherwise be difficult to express. Richards sums up his discussion by proclaiming that statements turn out to be the indirect expressions of sense, feeling, tone and intention. Let us now look into Richards' doctrine in poetry. Richards gives importance to the role of the reader in locating the meaning of a poem. The meaning of a poem rests in the reader's analysis of the text and the response to it. Readers analyze the text and frame judgments related to it. Every reader is capable of deciphering the same meaning in the same text and the text is an organic whole. However, obstacles occur when variation of meaning arises. Richard's ideas are oriented towards differentiating the belief of readers from that of poets. At the rise of contradiction between the belief of readers and the poets, the readers fail to comprehend the entire meaning from the text. The differences between the temperaments of the reader and his personal experience give rise to differences in the meaning from the text. The hindrance that brings variation in meaning is the doctrinal belief of the readers. In this sense, Richards locates two kinds of beliefs, mainly intellectual belief and emotional belief. Whereas intellectual belief estimates an idea to a doctrine, emotional belief relates to the state of mind. The blending of the intellectual and the emotional beliefs results in a good kind of being. Variation in meaning occurs when there is freedom for beliefs and disbeliefs. However, human mind cannot be freed from the impure thoughts. Therefore, the reader should consciously take efforts to obtain every single meaning even when obstacles arise. The sincere reader has perfect and genuine mind that is free from impurities, and in this sense the reader would be freed from obstructions due to restricted flow of thoughts. Richards was mainly known for his psychological approach to criticism. Let us look into some of the characteristic features of his psychological mode. Richards attributes a healing property to poetry because of its ability to organize human impulses. He says that art possesses the capacity to restore emotional balance, mental equilibrium and peace. The human mind becomes capable of organizing itself. A society that promotes art exhibits better mental and emotional calmness than societies discourage arts. Art provides pleasure due to the harmonious blend of the faculties that recognize the greatness of art. The complex thoughts, feelings and desires get stimulated by arts and they are put into order, leading to peace and pleasure. Close analysis of anonymous poems intend to give psychological benefits to students. By actively responding to the currents of emotions, feelings and impulses, the students would arrive at what Richards calls organized response. Richards says that catharsis does not result from the purgation of any impulse. It is the outcome of the harmonious blend of contradictory impulses. Richards' psychological approach resolves the old controversy regarding the sources of tragic pleasure and the nature of tragic catharsis. To conclude, in the words of George Watson, Richards is simply the most influential theorist of the century, as Eliot is the most influential of descriptive critics. Unquote. Richards is believed to have announced the arrival of Anglo-American new criticism of the 30s and 40s. The technique of verbal analysis is built on his theoretical foundations. Under the influence of Richards, criticism was viewed as a scientific endeavor that considered the primacy of psychology for its functioning. In this module, we have discussed only the most important aspects related to the book. Let us now summarize what we have done in this session so far. New criticism is a kind of analysis on specific literary texts, either as a deliberate application of an earlier formulated theory or a non-theoretical investigation. I.A. Richards at the Cambridge University in the 1920s illustrated this practice in his book Practical Criticism, a study of literary judgment, that was published in 1929. In this exercise, students were asked to analyze a concise poem without any information about the author, date or conditions under which the work was produced. By this method, Richard intended to concentrate on the words on the page only, without referring to the biographical or historical contexts. This procedure of analysis was adopted by the Cambridge School and became the most preferred scheme of rigorous criticism in British and American universities. We now have questions for you that would help you to understand this module better. Until we meet next time with sessions on other essays, thank you.